Hello, how are y'all doing this week? So we're getting into the comparison and contrast module, and what I'm going to talk to y'all about for this week is something called the basis of comparison, which is, at least to me, this is the most important thing that you need to think about when you start thinking about putting together your comparison and contrast essay, which is before you can even think about structure, organization, any of that, you've got to make a decision. What two things are you actually going to compare and contrast? So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the criteria that should go into that decision if you're doing a comparison and contrast essay. So where we have to start is thinking about the commonalities that two or more things have. What are those elements that they have in common? Because we got to start there before we can start thinking about differences. Okay, so I think a really good way to approach that is to think about think about things that are often set up as rivalries. All right, so there's a reason why there are competitive things out there, rivalries and so forth. Okay, so one of those, for example, that you might be familiar with is Pepsi versus Coke. Do you prefer Coke or do you prefer Pepsi? Or maybe you don't prefer either of them, but that's a very common comparison out there. And why? Because they're both sodas. They're both dark sodas. They both contain cola syrup. They're both two of the oldest brands of soft drinks that are out there. They've both been hugely popular for over 100 years, and they've been intense rivals for each other's business just about ever since both came into existence. I think Coke was first, and then Pepsi followed just a few years after, but they have always been in fierce competition. And again, the reason for that is because they have those strong commonalities. All right, let's move to our next slide. Or we might want to think of this in terms of fast food. McDonald's and Burger King, for example, those are two restaurants that have a very strong basis of comparison. Why? Because, well, they're both fast food for starters, but they're both two of the largest fast food franchises in the country, in fact, probably even in the world, right? And they're both known for some similar things, like they both sell burgers, they both sell fries. There are some important differences, of course. You know, McDonald's tends to fry their burgers, whereas Burger King flame broils theirs. But those are things that you would talk about as you get into the differences between the two restaurants. But again, we would have to start with what are those commonalities? They're both, they're both famous for their value meals, but McDonald's actually started that trend. Neither of their menus are healthy in any regard. Okay, so that might be a point of comparison there. And then let's look at another common rivalry, Auburn versus Alabama. What is the basis of comparison? Well, they're both college football teams, and more specifically, they're both Alabama college football teams. And if you've grown up in Alabama, you are familiar with that rivalry and why it exists. So all of this is to hammer home the point that if you've got a valid basis of comparison, it means the two topics you are comparing must have enough commonality to make the comparison valid. You know, if you've heard that old saying about apples versus oranges, for example, that's where that comes from, right? Because we're talking about fruit, two types of fruit that are very similar. So let's talk about what happens in certain situations where um, maybe your basis of comparison is not as valid.